Welcome to an exploration of Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit, a foundational work in Western philosophy. First published in 1807, this book serves as a necessary introduction to Hegel's larger philosophical system. It guides readers through the complex journey of the mind, from basic sense experience to the heights of scientific philosophy. Hegel's intention was for this work to be a stepping stone, one that can be set aside once the student has reached a mature philosophical perspective. In this video, we'll break down the stages of consciousness, self-consciousness, reason, spirit, and absolute knowing, making sense of Hegel's intricate arguments and their significance for philosophy and beyond. Hegel saw the phenomenology of spirit as a necessary preface to his philosophical system, but not as an end in itself. Its purpose is to guide the reader through the confusions and misunderstandings of consciousness, leading to a properly philosophical point of view. The book traces the mind's journey from immediate sense consciousness to the position of scientific philosophy, demonstrating that this is the only path the mind can take after its intellectual and spiritual adventures. However, Hegel also recognized that this sequence is not the only possible path to knowledge. Different cultures and times might take different routes. The phenomenology blends historical contingency with logical necessity, showing how the mind's development is both shaped by history and guided by reason. Central to Hegel's approach is the dialectical method, a process where each stage of thought contains contradictions that propel it forward to a higher stage. Unlike mathematical reasoning, which follows strict identities, dialectic involves higher-order commentary, revealing relationships that go beyond the obvious. For Hegel, necessary connections are not psychologically compulsory. They represent possible tracks the mind may take. The dialectical process is richer and more flexible than mathematical inference, allowing for multiple routes to the same philosophical destination. This method underpins the entire phenomenology, guiding the mind from simple awareness to absolute knowledge. Hegel's philosophy emphasizes the interplay of unity and negation. Every concept or stage is defined not only by what it is, but also by what it is not, its negation. Yet, these oppositions exist within a larger unity that holds them together. Negation is essential to both conception and being, but it always operates within a unity that cannot be divided into self-sufficient elements. This unity transforms independent elements into mere aspects or moments of a whole. The dialectical process is thus a movement through negation and reconciliation, ultimately leading to a comprehensive unity. The dialectical process begins with the understanding, the faculty that distinguishes and segregates aspects within an indivisible whole. The understanding gives non-independent elements a quasi-independence, which is then challenged by other aspects that negate, oppose, or supplement the first. Ultimately, all aspects are integrated into a many-sided but indivisible whole. This process is not a temporal sequence like the growth of an organism, but a logical development akin to the unfolding of mathematical principles. The culmination of this process is absolute knowledge, where nothing remains outside the system. Hegel, the universal is not a weak abstraction from individual cases, but the force that realizes itself in the individual and empirical world. The universal is responsible for both the being and intelligibility of particulars. In the phenomenology, conceptual treatment can leap from one empirical scene to another, connecting scientific universals, fellow minds, historical figures, and religious experiences. The focus is always on the universal shapes that emerge in history and thought, and how they align and lead to one another, ultimately forming facets of a single, all-inclusive concept. Hegel's dialectical development is a logical growth of notions out of notions. This growth is visible to the phenomenological student, who can see the logical connections between different phases of thought, even if those who lived through them could not. The mind of humanity did not always see the necessary steps from one phase to another, but the phenomenologist can arrange them in a logical order. From the very beginning, it's important to frame viable conceptions of the logical movements that notional shapes of spirit must undergo, recognizing that temporal sequences are often inadequate reflections of deeper logical transitions. Hegel's view of subjectivity is deeply intertwined with universality. Conscious spirit, or subjectivity, is analyzed in terms of universality, specificity, and singularity. The subject is not a detached entity, but the active universal that distinguishes itself from the specific and individual, interprets and controls its objects, and ultimately returns to self-consciousness. The thinking ego is identified with the categories used in the constitution of objects, and at the end of the phenomenology, The conceptualization of all objects is seen as the imposition of the form of self. The subject is thus the logical function of universality in a unique detachment from its instances. Life of conscious spirit, as depicted in the Phenomenology, is a series of phases where moments of the notion are detached and then reintegrated in an ongoing rhythm. Hegel's thought is always centered on the self-active concept and idea, transcending existentialist and other philosophical approaches. Each phase in the dialectic is not Hegel's final word, but a moment in a larger, ongoing process. Phenomenology is thus not just a historical or existential account, but a dynamic unfolding of spirit through its own self-alienation and return. Hegel's philosophical journey was influenced by his personal experiences and the historical context of his time. His relationships, education, and the political climate shaped the specific path he traced in the Phenomenology. While some of these influences are clear, much remains enigmatic. Hegel's literary genius and unconscious motivations often make his writing profound yet elusive. Understanding the Phenomenology fully would require a psychological and metapsychological analysis similar to that applied to great literary figures. Despite this, the work remains a powerful guide through the thickets of philosophical development. Introduction to the Phenomenology provides a preliminary conception of how the study of the shapes of mind can lead from immediate experience to scientific knowledge. It addresses the skepticism that such a process might only replace one inadequate view with another, and counters Kant's claim that knowledge can never reach the thing in itself. Hegel argues that the distinction between things as they are and as they appear to consciousness must itself be a distinction within consciousness. The progress of knowledge is a constant correction of previous views, culminating in a state where knowledge and object coincide. Hegel acknowledges that knowledge may always seem inadequate to its object, but he ingeniously includes the notion of endless progress within his final conception of knowledge. For Hegel, seeing the object as an endless problem is itself a resolution. The object's role is to stimulate knowledge and practice. The teleological view of objectivity, as destined to be interpreted by consciousness, is ultimately satisfying and leaves no room for the hidden or inexplicable. This prepares the way for the study of being in the logic and the subsequent philosophies of nature and spirit. First major section of the Phenomenology explores consciousness in three stages: sense-certainty, perception, and understanding. Sense-certainty confronts objects in their rich individuality, but fails to make anything definite of them. The attempt to capture the unique quality of experience is undermined by the flux of experience and the generality of demonstrative words like this or now. The richness and immediacy of sense-certainty are thus shown to be illusory, leading consciousness to seek more stable forms of knowledge. Perception, the next stage, tries to distinguish properties or qualities in the immediately given, but struggles to integrate them into a unified object. The attempt to attribute separate characters to a single thing leads to contradictions and confusion. Perception is thus dialectically flawed, unable to reconcile the unity and diversity of objects. This impasse pushes consciousness toward the stage of understanding, where it seeks universal patterns behind appearances. The stage of understanding, consciousness seeks to explain the world through universal patterns, such as laws and forces. However, this realm is also flawed, as it cannot fully account for the integration of different essential natures into a single system. The recognition that conscious mind imparts unity to its objects leads to the transition from consciousness of objects to self-consciousness, the awareness of consciousness itself. Self-consciousness, the object of consciousness, becomes another conscious ego. The subject now seeks to interpret and master individualized contents, both intellectually and practically. At first, the subject tries to assert its own universality over others, leading to the famous lord and bondsman, master-slave dialectic. This struggle for recognition reveals that true universality can only be achieved when all subjects recognize and promote universality in each other. Lord and bondsman dialectic illustrates the dynamics of recognition. The subject seeks to be recognized by another, but only as the sole center of universality. This leads to a life-and-death struggle, where each risks everything for recognition. However, recognition from a subordinate is ultimately unsatisfying, and the bondsman, through work and service, attains a higher consciousness than the Lord. The dialectic corrects itself in the ideal of mutual recognition and cooperation among equals. After the struggle for recognition, self-consciousness may withdraw into stoicism or skepticism, seeking refuge in abstract reason or total detachment. In its most extreme form, consciousness identifies with irrational particularity and projects universality into an unattainable beyond, resulting in the unhappy consciousness. This separation of moments that belong together cannot last, and consciousness must eventually return to a more reasonable frame of mind, recognizing the universality active in all subjects. Next major phase is reason, which first seeks to observe itself in the world and then to impose itself through action. Observing reason studies nature and the mind, searching for universal laws and patterns. However, attempts to reduce consciousness to physical structures, such as in physiognomy and phrenology, ultimately fail. Reason then turns to action, seeking satisfaction through pleasure, virtue, and moral law, but each approach reveals its own limitations and contradictions. Reason's pursuit of pleasure, hedonism, leads to an endless, unsatisfying search for new experiences. The romantic life of the heart, with its grand projects, clashes with the equally grand projects of others. The pursuit of virtue, in turn, becomes quixotic and impractical, interfering with both the virtue of others and the sensible order of society. Each attempt to find fulfillment through subjective or objective means ultimately fails, pushing reason toward a higher form of universality. Having exhausted the possibilities of subjective and objective fulfillment, reason moves toward the stage of spirit. Here, universality is no longer merely formal or subjective, but becomes substantial in the ethical life of a community. The laws and customs of society give concrete form to universal principles, making ethical life genuinely possible. The transition from reason to spirit marks a shift from individual striving to communal existence. Hegel finds the roots of spiritual life in the ethical world of Greek tragedy, where the individual is torn between the laws of the family and the state. The family law, associated with the unconscious and the feminine, often clashes with the public, rational law of the state, associated with the masculine. This conflict leads to guilt and tragedy, revealing the deep sources of disunity in ethical life. A truly moral life, Hegel suggests, must be both deep and wide, caring for individual circumstances as well as universal principles. Dissolution of the primitive ethical community leads to an atomistic society, exemplified by imperial Rome. Here, individuals are reduced to property owners, and the state is concerned only with legal and economic relations. This lack of intimacy and warmth creates a sense of alienation, where individuals cannot find themselves in the community. Hegel uses this example to illustrate the consequences of a purely external, impersonal social order. In the section on spirit, Hegel explores the tension between Enlightenment rationality and religious faith. The Enlightenment represents a culture of endless progress, bureaucracy, and economic variability, while faith seeks to return to the concreteness and integrity of simpler times. Hegel shows that the apparent opposition between critical insight and pious belief is, in fact, a sham fight. Each depends on the other for its meaning. Enlightenment's abstraction and faith's simplicity are two sides of the same coin. Culmination of alienated spirituality is the pursuit of absolute freedom, as seen in the French Revolution. The pure self-assertion of the individual leads to the destruction of all established forms, resulting in terror and the suppression of individuality. Hegel critiques this stance as ultimately self-destructive, unable to generate genuine leadership or lasting principles. The dialectic thus moves beyond the empty abstractions of liberty, equality, and fraternity. Next stage is the morality of dutiful subjectivity, where individuals reflect deeply on conduct and respect the consciences of others. The moral view of the world sees duty as the purpose of both nature and the afterlife, requiring theological postulates to guarantee endless progress and happiness. However, this stance is fraught with contradictions and hypocrisy, leading to a cycle of striving and disappointment. True conscientiousness, for Hegel, is the simple doing of one's duty as one sees it, without concern for external validation. Conscientiousness becomes a kind of religion, where each person legislates for themselves, but recognizes the validity of others' conscientious decisions. This mutual respect can lead to a higher reconciliation, where differences are understood and forgiven. Morality thus becomes religious, with a spirit that transcends individual differences and is rightly thought of as divine. Hegel's analysis highlights the strengths and limitations of conscience as a guide to ethical life. Hegel's Phenomenology of Religion traces the forms in which humanity has conceived a spirituality that transcends the human. He discusses the Iranian religion of light, Indian pantheism, Egyptian religion, and the Greek art religion, each representing different fusions of rationality and sensuousness. All forms of religion, which unite the human with the transcendent, eventually decay in periods of alienation. Christianity, as the absolute and revealed religion, appears at such a time, offering a union of the individual and the universal. Hegel, Christianity represents the union of human and divine natures, both in the person of Jesus and in the community of believers. This union is the sense and truth of everything, embodying the redemptive power at the heart of Hegel's philosophy. The Christian God is essentially redemptive, and Hegel's system is a philosophy of redemption, a self-alienation that returns to itself in victory. His philosophical reconstitution of Christianity is both faithful and transformative. Journey of consciousness in the phenomenology culminates in absolute knowing. Consciousness has confronted the world through the senses, organized it perceptually, and explained it scientifically. It has learned to recognize itself in others, contributed to social life, and experienced the tensions of community and faith. In absolute knowing, all forms of objectivity are seen as identical with those essential to the thinking subject. The distinction between objective truth and subjective certainty vanishes, and the concept unites both aspects in itself. Absolute knowing, Hegel anticipates the development of the scientific system, where notions develop purely out of notions through their own inner oppositions and mediations. This system must then show the self-externalization of logical categories in nature and their return in the philosophy of spirit. The phenomenological we that has been examining consciousness now becomes the final shape of consciousness itself, ready to study the alignments of shapes as both forms of being and certitude. Hegel's preface discusses the nature of philosophical truth and the necessity of a scientific system. He argues that truth is not a static result, but a process that includes both aim and execution. The true shape of truth is the scientific system, where knowledge is actual only as system. Hegel rejects both formalism and the complacency that seeks only edification, insisting that philosophy must strive for genuine insight rather than mere comfort or abstraction. Negation plays a central role in Hegel's conception of truth. The process of distinguishing and overcoming oppositions is essential to the development of knowledge. Truth is not a ready-made coin, but the result of a dialectical process that includes its own negation. The false is not simply discarded, but is preserved as a moment within the true. This dynamic view of truth contrasts with the static, dogmatic approach that seeks fixed results. Hegel contrasts mathematical and philosophical cognition. In mathematics, the proof is external to the object, and once the result is reached, the process is forgotten. In philosophy, however, the process of becoming is internal to the object itself. The genesis of substance is an unbroken transition into existence, and vice versa. The movement of philosophical cognition unites existence and essence, making the process itself an essential part of the result. Hegel, the true is actual only as system. Substance is essentially subject, and the spiritual alone is actual. The spiritual relates to itself, is determinate, and abides within itself. Science is the realm where spirit knows itself as spirit, building its own actuality in its own element. The beginning of philosophy presupposes that consciousness dwells in this element, but this element achieves perfection only through its own movement and development. Science must provide the individual with a ladder to its standpoint, showing that self-certainty belongs to it. The process of coming to be described in the phenomenology is not just an initiation into science, but a universal journey of spirit's formative education. Each individual must pass through the stages of universal spirit, acquiring what lies at hand and making it their own. This process is both a personal and a collective journey. Formative education, or Bildung, is the process by which spirit acquires its substance and becomes self-conscious. The individual must absorb the content of universal spirit, passing through its stages as shapes already left behind. This process is not just about acquiring information, but about transforming oneself into a substance that is an object of thought and that thinks. The task is to free determinate thoughts from their fixity and impart spiritual life to the universal. Movement of pure essences constitutes the nature of scientific method. This movement is the necessary expansion of content into an organic whole, encompassing the entire sphere of secular consciousness in its development. The pathway to knowledge is not a casual philosophizing, but a complete process that lingers over each moment as a concrete individual shape. The patience of spirit in world history is mirrored in the patience required of the individual learner. Phenomenology is the science of the experience consciousness goes through. Spirit develops itself in the element of consciousness, with each moment appearing as a shape of consciousness. Experience is the movement in which the immediate becomes alienated from itself and then returns to itself, revealing its actuality and truth. The disparity between the I and substance is the negative that moves them, ultimately showing that substance is essentially subject. Death, or non-actuality, is the most dreadful thing, but the life of spirit is not one that shrinks from death. Instead, spirit endures and maintains itself through devastation, winning its truth in utter dismemberment. This power is not a positive closing of eyes to the negative, but a tarrying with the negative that converts it into being. The familiar becomes the property of pure self-consciousness only through this process. Ancient study was the complete formation of natural consciousness, philosophizing about everything and making itself universal. Modern study finds abstract forms ready-made and must work to free determinate thoughts from their fixity. The task is not to purge sensuous apprehension, but to give actuality and spiritual life to the universal. This is harder than transforming sensuous existence, as fixed thoughts have the power of the negative for their substance. Scientific method in philosophy is the movement of pure essences, expanding content into an organic whole. The path to knowledge is a necessary and complete process, not a series of random thoughts. Each moment must be lingered over as a concrete whole, reflecting the patience of spirit in world history. The individual learner benefits from the abbreviated, simplified determinations of thought that have already been achieved. True is not a static result, but a process that includes its own becoming. The absolute is essentially a result, becoming what it truly is only in the end. The beginning is only the universal, and only through mediation does it become actual. The process of becoming is identical with the result, and the self is the sameness that relates to itself. This dynamic view of truth is central to Hegel's system. Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit remains a profound and challenging work, tracing the development of consciousness from immediate experience to absolute knowing. Its dialectical method, emphasis on unity and negation, and vision of spirit's journey continue to influence philosophy, psychology, and the humanities. By understanding the stages of consciousness, self-consciousness, reason, spirit, and absolute knowing, we gain insight into the unfolding of human thought and the possibility of true knowledge. Hegel's legacy endures as an invitation to engage deeply with the movement of spirit in history and in ourselves. Those inspired to delve deeper, Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit offers a rich field for study and reflection. The work's complexity rewards careful reading and engagement with its arguments. Supplementary materials, such as analyses, commentaries, and translations, can provide valuable guidance. Whether you are a student of philosophy or simply curious about the development of human consciousness, Hegel's masterpiece offers enduring insights into the nature of mind, knowledge, and reality.